As I was going through my notes and getting ready to dive into the first and second seal, I realized there's a couple of things that I need to do to set the stage that I had not covered in the first two introductories. So forgive me. I know I promised you I would jump right into the first seal, but I do want you to open your Bibles to Revelation chapter 6. It is my hope, it is my goal, that when we get done with this chapter, that you'll have a different perspective on the seals. Hopefully a little better understanding and a more integrated understanding. Now remember that you cannot separate chapter 6 from chapter 4 and 5. Chapter 4 and 5 sets the stage, as you will. And I used this example before. I want you to think of it. You have just gone to a play. And in the play, there is a backdrop. There is a stage setting. Chapter 4 and chapter 5 are the stage setting. Without that, this chapter 6 makes no sense. You cannot separate the two. So we need to understand 5 and 6 is what's going on in heaven. And now, after Jesus has been enthroned as the Davidic king, he is given a scroll. And chapter 6 now moves into what happens when the seals are opened. So we are seeing a connection between Jesus opening the seals in heaven and activity that's taking place on earth. So what I want to do is I'm just going to read the first 4 seals, just to kind of get you into the mood of the seals. We're going to talk about the diagramming of the seals and helping you understand them. The first 4 sort of go together. Then the 5th is separate, and the 6th and 7th is separate. I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals. Then I heard one of the living creatures say in a voice like thunder, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a white horse, and its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror, bent on conquest. When the Lamb opened the 2nd seal, I heard the 2nd living creature say, "Come." Then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth, and to make men slay each other. To him was given a large sword. When the Lamb opened the 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and there before me was a black horse, and its rider was holding a pair of scales in its hand. Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the 4 living creatures say, "A quart of wheat for a day's wages, 3 quarts of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil in the wine." Then the Lamb opened the 4th seal, and I heard the voice of the 4th living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there was before me a pale horse. Its rider was named Death and Hades. His rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. They were given power over 1/4 of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by wild beasts of the earth. That sounds pretty scary to me. Let's just stop reading this right now. Because that's what people usually do. They read this, they don't understand the symbology. They see some of these things and they freak out, close the book, say, "This book is too scary to read." I hope by the time I get done, you will understand all of the imagery in this, and you'll be able to make application to where it's not scary, but it makes sense. So, as I said before, the 6 seals begin after the ascension of Jesus. After the cross and Jesus ascended into heaven, Jesus is handed a scroll. That is the beginning. The end of the 6 seals take place when Jesus comes again. So we are seeing the history of the Christian period being displayed through symbols of revelation from the 1st century to the last century. And let's pray it's the 21st century is the last century.
Amen.
We start off with the inauguration of the heavenly sanctuary. I mentioned this before in an earlier sermon. As I studied through this, something that I had thought, that I had envisioned in my mind, was that the heavenly sanctuary was in operation throughout the history of Christianity. But I've come to believe that the heavenly sanctuary was not in operation in heaven until the blood of the Lamb was shed. Because what has to happen for the sanctuary to be initiated or inaugurated? It required blood in the Old Testament. But until Jesus' blood was shed on the cross, what blood could inaugurate the heavenly sanctuary? So the heavenly sanctuary may have been there, but it wasn't in operation as we understand it. It started to be in operation in the first century, after the ascension of Jesus. We then see in Revelation chapter 5 the enthronement of the Davidic king. Remember, the Old Testament points forward to the Messiah being a descendant of David, who has the rightful keys to the kingdom. Jesus took that on when he went to heaven, and he became the actual king that David and all of the kings of the Old Testament pointed forward to. The one like Melchizedek, greater than any earthly king. As an aside, does anybody remember what Saul did that really got God angry with him in the Old Testament? The first king. Not Saul who became Paul, but King Saul. What did King Saul do that he lost favor with God? Anybody remember? He offered sacrifices. And in the Old Testament, the priests offered sacrifices. The king was never allowed. But he got nervous, he went and offered sacrifices, and it was all over. Samuel came to him and said, "You have really offended God. Because there's only one who can do both. And that's Jesus, who is both king and priest. He is the only one who can be the king and the priest, who can offer sacrifices and be the king." So, the Old Testament shows that there was a distinction between the two, but Jesus brings the two together. In him is completeness. He is both king and he is priest, and he can do both. But here in Revelation 5, we saw the enthronement of the Davidic king. I took you to Deuteronomy 17 last week, and I want you to go there again because I think it's really important. The covenant of the king is extremely significant in the role of the seals. In fact, we're going to talk quite a bit about the covenant today and its implications in the seals. Deuteronomy 17 and verse 18 through 20. When he, the king, takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of the law or a copy of the covenant. They are sometimes synonymous in the Old Testament. Taken from the priests who are Levites. It is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his brothers, and turn from the law to the right or to the left. Then he and his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom in Israel. So the covenant promises of the Old Testament are extremely important as the backdrop to the seals. Now, I've told you before, and I'm repeating some of this because we have people here for the first time, there is nothing in the book of Revelation, there is almost no concept that cannot be connected to the Old Testament. In fact, there's absolutely very little new in the book of Revelation. Everything is kind of a repeat where John has pulled Old Testament concepts together and put it into a unified book depicting the future based on the past. If you read the book of Revelation through the eyes of the Old Testament, it makes so much more sense. It becomes so much clearer. So we're going to do a little bit of that this morning. The background to the Revelation chapter 6 are the blessings and the curses of the covenant, found in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 32. Have you ever read the blessings and the curses of the covenant before? Let's turn to Deuteronomy 32. There's some really interesting dynamics in this chapter. It is the whole chapter, by the way. Actually, I think I want Deuteronomy 17. Let's try it. Leviticus 26. That's what I want to go to first. Sorry. No, Leviticus 26. It's on the screen, if you forget it. That's what I'm looking for. Leviticus 26. Now, if you look at verse 3 through verse 13, you see the blessings of the covenant. And I want you to notice something. There's a little bitty word that we miss so often in the Bible. It's only 2 letters, and sometimes we read right past it. What does it say in verse 3?
If.
If. How do you understand the word if? If you clean your room, you can have dessert. If you pick up your dirty socks, you can have candy. How do we understand the word if? It's conditional. There has to be some follow-through. If, then, is a common construct in human language. If, then. So God says, in the blessings of the covenant, if you follow my decrees and are careful to obey my commands, and then he goes on with all the blessings. I will send you rain in season, and your threshing and your harvesting will be, and you won't have diseases, and I will grant you peace in the land, and I will look with favor upon you. And then in verse 9 he says, and I will keep my covenant with you. Amen. And then he says, I will make you the head and not the tail. And he goes on with all these wonderful promises that every one of us would love to have. But it's conditional. But then we start in verse 14 and go through the rest of the chapter, or at least to verse 45. Notice how this one starts. But if. So you know that whenever anybody says but, what does that say? Everything before that is pretty much non-existent, right? I really love you, but you make me so angry. But if you do not keep my commandments, if you do not listen to me, if you reject my decrees and abhor my laws and fail to carry out my commands and violate my covenants, verse 16, then I will, and this is the curses of the covenant. I'm not going to read through this list. I want you to. And you will notice that by reading through this, you will see a lot of words and concepts that are connected to the seals. Things like famine. Things like desolation. And these words are repeated in here. And it almost appears that the curses of the covenant are behind the seals. Now, the curses and the blessings of the covenant are neutral. This was not given just to God's people. This was given to everyone. Follow me now. When we looked at the 7 churches, who were the 7 churches directly affected by? Or who was it implied the message was sent to? God's people. Those messages are specific. So when I gave you the chart, and you took a look at it, and you looked at the top, you can put remnant up here, you can put God's people, you can put the 144,000, because all of those terms are synonymous in the book of Revelation. But now, under the seals, who would you put on the top column? This is generic. This is everybody. The seals involve both God's people and those who aren't God's people. The seals are not specific to a group of people like the churches are. And you need to remember that. Each of these, when we go through the churches, it's specific. We go through the seals, it's pretty much everybody. When we go through the trumpets, who do you think the trumpets are specifically designed for? Those who have not accepted Jesus. Or whatever you want to call them. The wicked, the unrighteous, the unfaithful. So you see a description in each of these grouping of 7 directed towards different groups of people. God's people, everybody, the wicked. I'm going to use that word, but I don't like it. I'm going to actually give you another word later. Does anybody need one of these charts? I still have some extras. Somebody has asked for some. I've gone through the churches, and I've kind of filled them in. I've given you some relative dates. And as we go through the seals and the trumpets, we're going to fill these in. Judy, there's a couple over here. This chart is kind of a tool that I want you to use to jot some notes down. It's a way to study the Bible, because what happens is we're going to go through the sequence, and then I want you to do some cross comparisons, because the first church and the first seal and the first trumpet are connected. So there's a connection this way, but there's also a connection this way. And you will be amazed that once you fill this out vertically and you start looking across horizontally, there will be some real interesting perspectives that you'll gain. So this is something that I started doing when I was starting, and I was like, man, this opened up my eyes to some significant things that I would have missed. Remember, the book of Revelation has a lot of parallelism. There's a lot of duplication, and in that duplication, there's additional information. It's only when you lie them side by side and compare them that information suddenly starts to jump out at you. So Leviticus 26, the curses and the blessings of the covenant, is a backdrop. It is kind of a background scene to the discussions of what's going on in Revelation chapter 6 in the opening of the seals. So, I've already gone ahead. The seals really are dealing with both God's people and the wicked. Because, whether it's the curses or the blessings, if you follow God's laws, you will be blessed. You don't need to know God, but if you follow God's commandments, if you behave in a way that is consistent with God, you will be blessed. Now, I've used this example a number of times, and I'm going to use it. Some of you have heard it before. Do you remember the time of the Dark Ages when the bubonic plague was ravaging Europe? For those of you who remember history, and we talk about the bubonic plague, and we think about all the millions of people who were dying, do you understand what was going on surrounding that? What caused it? Well, in Europe, people were starting to move into the cities. They had been living out in the country and living apart, but Europe was starting to enter into its industrial phase, and people started moving into cities. How was the plumbing at the time that they started building houses in the cities? They didn't have any. So how did they get rid of their waste?
Street.
Does anybody remember, some of you are old enough to remember chamber pots. How many of you remember chamber pots? Oh, raise your hand. My grandma used chamber pots. That's where you took a pot and you went to the bathroom in it and put it under the bed and put a cover on it. And in the morning you took it out and you dumped it. That's pretty much the waste system during this time. And guess what? Where they dumped it? They're in the city. They dumped it out the window and it went into the streets, in the gutters. And there was human waste in the gutters. What did that attract? Rodents and rats. And we know that the disease was on the rats. The rats didn't have the disease. They were carriers. And so people started getting sick. Now, they did not understand biology and microbiology, and they didn't understand all of these causes, and nobody was really figuring it out. But you know who wasn't getting sick from the bubonic plague? The Jews. Do you know why? Because there's an instruction in the Bible that says, remove the human waste from the camp and bury it, because God says, I am a holy God and you cannot have that in the camp. Oh, that sounds legalistic to me. It saved their lives. They didn't understand it, but they followed it. And by following God's commands, they were saved, and they did not get the bubonic plague. The rats didn't come around because they took their waste, buried it out of the camp because God told them to. God didn't explain why. The curses of the covenant, the blessings of the covenant are generic in that if you follow them, you will be blessed, whether you understand it or not. If you follow God's principles, the very fact of following them is a blessing, irrespective if you understand them. And so this is where we are with the seals. So the other thing that Revelation 6 parallels is the apocalyptic sermon of Jesus. Does anybody know where that's found?
Matthew 26.
Matthew chapter
26.
No, we're talking about Jesus' end-time prophecies.
24.
Matthew chapter 24. If you read Matthew 24, and I'm not going to do this because it's going to take way too much time, Jesus was asked by his disciples, tell us when the end of time is and when the temple's going to be destroyed. And so Jesus gives his only prophetic instruction or teaching where he talks about future events. Compare the language of Matthew 24 with Revelation 6. And you are going to find that there are some parallels. Jesus was actually giving a futuristic prediction that is consistent in the book of Revelation in chapter 6. It's really interesting. And this is one of the things, if you want to learn how to study the Bible, there are times when you should take a photocopy of a chapter, like 24, and a photocopy of chapter 6 of Revelation, lay them side by side and read them back and forth. And underline the common words and common themes. You'll be amazed at what you find when you do this. And suddenly you start to see that John isn't just pulling this stuff out of the air. There is a background for what John is saying in Revelation 6. What the imagery that he's sharing is actually being described elsewhere in the Bible. So the Matthew 24, the sermon of Jesus in his apocalyptic sermon is what it's called. So what was the focus of Jesus' sermon? It's a general description to both believers and unbelievers of what was going to happen in the future. The same as Revelation 6 and the same as this. It's a generic vision of the activities and the events taking place from the first century till the end. That happens to both believers and unbelievers. So the opening of the seals is the consequence of taking the scroll in chapter 5, and Jesus is taking up this ministry. Now remember, the seals are opened in heaven, but the activities of the seals, the actual repercussions of the opening of the seals are taking place on earth. Nothing happens on earth that isn't directly linked to heaven. This should be good news. It should also be good news that Jesus is the one in control of the seals, not Satan. But remember, there are consequences to the covenant when God's people, or not, aren't following God's plan. Now, one question that's frequently asked, are we to take the seals literally or symbolically? If you take them literally, you can come up with some pretty weird interpretations. But the reality is that the book of Revelation was intended to be read and understood symbolically.